down toward the end of the chapter, and looking to see the Apostle Paul get into a world of hurt here. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Brother Toby, why don't you lead us in prayer?
Lord, we're thankful for this opportunity to be in your house this morning, Lord.
Yes, Lord.
I never want to take this for granted. I never want to be in your house, Lord. I pray that I would be where you would want me to be this morning, that I would be obedient to you, that I'd be patient at the same time, be ready to be bold for you at the same time, Lord.
Yes, Father.
Lord, I pray today that if there are any lost that are in our presence this morning, that you would just prick their hearts and convict them, Lord, so powerfully that they won't have anywhere else to run.
Yes, Father.
To you, Lord.
God grant it.
Save them if they do. I pray for Brother Bruce this morning as he teaches to us from the book of Acts, Lord. And just
God help
as
us.
we go forward. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Morning, Ronnie. Okay, Acts chapter 21. And we're going to start, we'll do a little recap. And go all the way back to verse 17. And we're going to run through this pretty quick because we've already covered this ground last week. And, you know, the Apostle Paul is in a transition here now. The three missionary journeys are over. And now he's going to begin a journey to Rome. And this isn't a missionary journey. This is a captivity. This is an incarceration. And he gets hauled off against his will, although he knew ahead of time that he was going to Rome. God had showed him that. And along his way, there were several people that said that don't go to Jerusalem. And they had, there was one Agabus, a prophet, that said that the man that owns this girdle, he bound his hands and feet with Paul's girdle and said the man that owns this girdle is going to be bound in Jerusalem. And so they tried their best to talk him out of going, and his response ran something like, what mean ye to weep and to break mine heart? No, you know, I'm not just ready to be in bonds in Jerusalem. I'm ready to die for Jesus Christ, right? And that's the way Paul approached everything he did for God, because it was that was the reality that he faced every day. You had to overcome all that stuff and put it in the rear view while you were facing the danger. And yeah, you might die today. You might die tomorrow. You just didn't know. And so there were a lot of people like Paul, a lot of people that faced things like that. And they were up against a bloodthirsty enemy in the unconverted Jewish nation and Jewish people. They were zealous for their heritage, and they perceived Christianity as a threat that was going to undermine their nation and their religion and the hold they had over people. You know, religion, that's the reason that Tim's always talking about it and preaching against it. Although the Bible says that pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is to remember the fatherless and widows in their affliction and keep yourself unspotted from the world. So there is a religion that God honors. But what we call religion today has a tendency to assume power over men and over people's lives and take what does not belong to them. Though they will usurp and take what belongs to Christ in his name. And God never anointed them to do that. So anyway, that's the way it runs, and that's the way it's going to be until Jesus Christ comes back. When the day of Christ dawns, I was reading the Bible last night, and And twice I read over that phrase, the day of Christ, and another one, the day of Jesus Christ. And so it's coming. And Zach said it was a good thing that God said that he would no longer destroy the world by water, because it kind of seems like it's going that way. But hopefully he hasn't obliterated the rainbow promise. All right, we're in the 21st chapter of Acts. I'm going to start reading verse 17. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And so what has happened here is Paul is coming from Asia, and they came by ship. They came under Cyprus, and they went to Caesarea, and there they unburdened their ship. And then they went to Ptolemais for a day. And then they got back in the ship. Instead of coming by land southward, they just got back in the boat, and they went out and came down to, I'm getting my wires crossed. Let me read it. And down around verse 1. Now in verse 3 it says, and when we had discovered Cyprus, we left it on the left hand, sailed into Syria, and landed in Tyre. Okay, they're in Tyre, for there the ship was done later burdened. And finding disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said, and let's go on down in verse 7. And when we had finished our course from Tyre, we came to Ptolemais and saluted the brethren and abode with them 1 day. And the next day, we that were of Paul's company departed and came into Caesarea. And we entered into the house of Philip the evangelist, which was one of the 7, and abode with him. And the same man had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. And we tarried there many days. And then Agabus comes down and binds his hands and feet with Paul's girdle, and you know how that went. And if you've ever read Pilgrim's Progress, you know that there's a man in there whose name is Porter, and he was the porter of a house there that Christian came to in his journey, and he had 4 daughters that prophesied, and they had names like Patience and Prudence and Charity, and those kinds of names. And so each of them had a lesson for Christian to take with him along his way. Well, that's what this is modeled after. All right. All right, now then, we'll come to 17. And when we were come to Jerusalem, so they left Caesarea, and they came by land then. They had to come by land to Jerusalem, and that was about a 70-mile trip. Okay? And we take that for granted. Man, we can do that in an hour in a car. Wonder how long it took them to go 70 miles. Pretty good trek in an arid place. And so in verse 19, and when he had saluted them, he declared particularly, let's go to verse 18. And the day following, Paul went in with James, and all the elders were present. And, verse 17 said, and when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. I wanted to say that first. And so there was a greeting. Then the next day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and said unto him, Thou seest, brother. And I thought this was so weird, because they didn't even finish the sentence until they kind of started dumping on Paul what their problem was. And so what is this? This is they'd had the Passover, and now this is the day of Pentecost. It's around there. And so Jerusalem is just teeming with people from all over the world. And they have come and they have heard that Paul's there. And so they're going to want to hear him. Some because they're anxious to hear about the victory of the gospel in the world. Others are there to speak ill and think ill of the gospel and of the Christian church. And so there's many thousands of people that's going to want to hear this man. And so in verse 20 it says, "And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe." So these are believing Jews. They're Christians, but they're still zealous of the law. It says, "And they are all zealous of the law, and they are informed of thee." They've heard of you certain things that are false. They are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews that which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought to not to circumcise their children, neither walk after the customs. So to abandon the customs of the law, to abandon them. And Paul never taught them that. He preached Jesus Christ and him crucified. If he came in here this morning, he'd preach Jesus Christ and him crucified. And he would let the message of Christ do what it's intended to do. And he wouldn't get into, well, you Jews should do this and you Gentiles that, although they did have a short list of things that they were teaching the Gentiles to do, to refrain from fornication, from things strangled, and from blood, and from idolatry. And so, but he didn't tell the Jews anywhere to forsake Moses or forsake the law. But he did teach them that Christ is the fulfillment of the law. You know, what's Paul's desire? In 10th chapter of Romans, I think it's verse 1, he says, "My heart's desire and prayer unto God is that all Israel would be saved." And then he goes into a discourse about that, and it says that they went about to establish their own righteousness. They have neglected and they've turned away from the righteousness of God that he has provided in Christ. And they have gone about to establish their own righteousness, which is after the law. But he says in verse 4 that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth, Jews and Gentile, right? Christ is the end of the law, not the end of its power, influence, the reason it exists, but it's the end of its pointing to the cross. It doesn't point to the cross anymore. The cross has been fulfilled. The price has been paid. And so Christ is the end. In other words, the law always was pointing to him. And now he's here. And so that doesn't kill the law, does it? And in fact, he came fulfilling the law, not destroying it. So we use the law when we tell a man to turn to God because you're a sinner. He said, "How do you know I'm a sinner?" Well, the law says this, this, and this. If you've broken any one of them, just one time, then you've broken them all. It's a golden chain. You break one link, and the whole chain is broken. You're lost. And every one of us did that. All right, now back to this. So they glorified God, and they talked about all those Jews that were there in Jerusalem that wanted to hear him, that were zealous of the law. And 21 says, "They're informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither walk after the customs. What is it therefore? What's it matter to you? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come." The multitude must needs come together, and they want to hear you. And so, because they've heard that you're here. "Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them, them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. And as touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. You might wonder, why were the Jews that were saved so intent on being so zealous anymore after those customs? But they had a tremendous pull on them from generations, all the way back to the crossing of Jordan into the Promised Land, and all the battles and all of the divvying up of all the land of Canaan, and the lots of land that were theirs specifically, and they gave their lives to till and to work and to care for. It had a tremendous pull on them. And so it wasn't easy for them just to pull up stakes and move off of that. Yeah, they trusted Christ, right? But I mean, look at it. When Paul was talking to the Galatians, he said that Peter came to Antioch one time and visiting, I suppose. And so when he came, hey, they had a high old time. There was a fellowship, They had a homecoming, and they were lining up to eat. It was a great place to be. And Peter was right in there with the rest of the Gentiles and the believing Jews, and they had a great time until a couple of days later, some Jewish brethren came from Jerusalem that were sent by James. And as soon as they got there, Peter stood off to himself. And he wouldn't have anything to do with the Gentiles because he was afraid of those boys and what they were going to report of him. Now, this is the same Peter that saw the vision, right? The sheet let down by the four corners, etc., to bring the gospel to the Gentile people. I don't know if this is before that or after that, so because it doesn't say. But he has stood off to himself now, and he refuses to eat with them. And so then when the rest of the Jewish brethren that were there, when Peter was there, saw what he did, they also all backed away from the Gentiles, to defer to those boys that came from Jerusalem. And Paul's watching this, Even Barnabas was taken with their dissimulation. He also joined that crew that stood off to themselves. And boy, he got his fire on, and he preached a message to those guys and burnt their hides, especially Peter, and rebuked him before them all. He gave him a stripping down that he would never forget. And because, it's just so powerful. The voice of those long gone elders and all of these traditions that they were brought up in, and it was ingrained in them and pounded in, and you do something against them. And God had given them those traditions. God had given them those observances. They couldn't just walk away from them. And so it was a part of their being, and they couldn't walk away. But Paul was right. And everything he preached to Peter that day, that's in Galatians chapter 2, by the way. If you want to read that, it's a good message. But, okay. So it was a powerful thing. So the elders there in Jerusalem, James tells them, we've got 4 boys here. They had a vow on them, maybe a Nazarite vow. And the period, the time for their vow is up. They're going to the temple. They're going to go in there. They're shaving their heads. And they're going to go in there for a week to purify themselves. And then at the end of the week, there'll be a sacrifice for them. And then they'll be able to come out. Okay, so that's where we are. And so verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. Now, these guys from Asia, they didn't mess around. These were the ones that were at Derbe, not Laodicea, Lystra, and those places, in Antioch, which was in Asia. They persecuted Paul and these Christians and chased them from place to place. So these are the Jews that wound up down in Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost, and they said the following. They said in verse 28, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place." Well, no, he didn't. But they assumed that he had brought them in. The next verse says, "For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple." They just supposed it. All right? And all the city was moved, and all the people ran together. And they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, serious business, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band, and all Jerusalem was in uproar. The band, that's talking about the Roman band. So tidings came to him, and anything that had disturbed the people, anything that got their blood pressure up just a point or two, it automatically was squelched by the Roman contingency there. All right. 32, who immediately took soldiers and centurions, so he must have had at least a couple of hundred, and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left, beating of Paul. They were beating him to death. So they weren't pulling punches on Paul. They weren't interrogating him. They were past all that. They were beating him to death. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, because he doesn't know who this guy is or why they're beating on him. So to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, in other words, there was such an outcry, everybody shouting, everybody declaring this, that, and the other, lies and truths, whatever. He couldn't make sense of it all. So he says, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And so when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. So he had soldiers on each side of him. He's a little guy. They had him by his arms and shoulders. They were just hauling him up the stairs. This was the Tower of Antonia there in the complex, the temple complex. And that was where the Roman garrison was stationed, there in the Tower of Antonia. There were 2 towers. What was the name of the other one? Anybody know? It was, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It looks like Mariamne, and it was probably pronounced Miriam. And it was named after the wife of Herod the Great. He built it in her honor. And then he imprisoned her in it until he killed her. He was so paranoid that he thought that she was playing the field and cheating on him. And so he wound up killing her. And once those men that were king, once they got an idea in their heads, you couldn't talk them out of it. You know, that's why it was always such a serious thing. If the king sent for you, you didn't know if this was going to go incredibly right or incredibly wrong. And so when Mephibosheth got the word that his his grandfather's enemy was calling for him, David, and he just wanted to do him a kindness. Can you imagine how terrified he was when he came in David's presence? He fell down on the floor, and he said, "Why do you look on a dead dog such as I am?" So he said, this man's going to sit and eat at my bread at my table for the rest of his life. I love that story. So, so they're hauling Paul up these stairs. You know, these stairs, they didn't have handrails. They were just step after step after step, and they went way about, quite a ways up the towers, built that way in case you were being attacked by an army. And those guys would have to climb those stairs, and you'd be up there in the tower with arrows, and you could pick them off before they got to the door. And then they'd have to beat through a considerable door. So it was just made that way, but it was precarious, I couldn't have walked it maybe with my cane, and I took it real slow. I might be able to make it, I don't know. So they're halfway up the stairs, and Paul gets the attention of the chief captain. And verse 36, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? He was surprised by this because of everything they had just accused him of. He thought that this guy was just a thug and that he was an infamous Egyptian that had been in their recent past, who led 4,000 men who were murderers out and tried to start an insurrection. And so the chief captain thinks that this is who Paul is. So he says, canst thou speak Greek? So he's surprised by that, such a learned language. Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? A bunch of really baser sort. But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. In other words, this isn't, podunk backwater. This is Tarsus. And Tarsus was a university, folks. He was from there. And so that got the chief captain's attention. He still doesn't know everything, though, about Paul. And another fact that he's getting ready to learn is that he's a Roman citizen. All right. So he says, but Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with his hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, men and brethren, fathers, such reverence, and no hype, no, he's not spitting anger and things back at him. He's got their attention, men, brethren, fathers, He says, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more their silence. And he saith, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. Now they knew that name, right? He left a university town to come to Jerusalem to be taught at the feet of Gamaliel. And he was considered the greatest of the teachers, greater than Nicodemus, okay? Nobody came up with Gamaliel. And taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto death. He's talking about Christianity. Binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus, to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem, for to be punished. That was his mandate that he received of the elders and of the high priest. And it came to pass that as I made my journey, and was come nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light around me, and I fell unto the ground. And I heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? So he leaves off the line, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw the light, and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? What else could he ask? There's nothing more he could have said. You know, in fact, in one of the other accounts, he says, Who art thou, Lord? And he'd have been thrilled to death if he'd have said, I'm Jehovah God. But he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. Oh, come on. And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man, according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came and stood. Now this is this is a verse that we're going to get into next week. And I'll let you chew on it all week. This is what Ananias said. Came unto me and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. In the same hour I looked up upon him. And he said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and shouldest hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. And now, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And it says, it doesn't say what happened after that. It says, And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and I heard this word, and saw him saying unto me, Make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. So he says, Ananias says to him, Why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Who's this book written to? Who's it written about? An easy question. Who's it written about? Anybody. Paul, you know who it's written about, right? His name is Jesus, starts with a J. All right. But who's it written to? His witnesses. And God expects his witnesses to be able to spiritually divine this with his help. The world can't. The world will read these words and they'll twist them into whatever they want them to say. They won't hear the truth, right? Let's see if I got any time. It's quarter till and nobody's coming barreling in, so maybe we talk about this. He says, why tarriest thou? Don't wait any longer. You know, you've seen the light. You've heard the voice. You know now who is calling you. What are you waiting for? He says, well, I tell you, I'm getting old. Receive thy sight, should know thy will. And, okay, verse 16. And now, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. What does it mean to be baptized? Somebody answer that question, please. Huh? Yeah, could be. Yeah, our ceremonial baptism is that, right? But what does that necessarily mean that all baptisms are that way? Baptize means to immerse into. And comes from the Greek word baptizo. All right. So he says, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized. Wash away thy sins. What happened when the day you got saved, or you got saved? You know, the first thing you heard a word from heaven. You saw the invisible, heard the inaudible, felt the intangible. He called you, and you came. Then you had some dealings with him down here. What did you do when you got here? You called on what? Somebody give me help. Help, men of Israel. You called on the Lord, didn't you? Right? You called on him. Good morning, Bonnie. You called on the Lord. And what did he do? He baptized you into his body. He sealed you with the Spirit unto the day of redemption. He says, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sin. That's what happened. My sins got washed away, folks, when that happened to me. When the Lord baptized me into his body, my sins were washed away. That was not exactly a public thing. In fact, they didn't, they suspected, but they didn't know for sure until I told them what had happened. And I really never been in church before, so I didn't know what to tell them. And the preacher, you know, they stand you up in front of the whole crowd and they say, you got anything to say? And I just said, I can feel it. That was all and they just say amen real loud, and that was the end, right? I can feel it, and I can still feel it to this day. That baptism I've never been the same. I've never been the same since that baptism. If you read this carnally, you'll come to a carnal conclusion, and you'll run everybody down to the water hole and baptize them there, when man isn't the one doing the baptizing here. God's doing it. And then we do it, as Sister Ronnie pointed out, in a ceremonial way, as a public show that we have been with the Lord. So he expects us as his people to define his holy word and be able to make a rightly divided opinion of this. Well, that's all that we have time